Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I'd like to shout out my brother's channel. He's got a history channel called Forgotten Lives, where he focuses on sharing the lives of extraordinary people who have been forgotten throughout history. I've really enjoyed listening to his work. People who have really accomplished incredible feats who you've never even heard of. Who knows, it could be good for a trivia quiz, but they are really fun lessons. I'm going to leave a link at the top of the description and at the end of the video for you to check out. But for now, we're going to be heading into the depths of the forest for some cryptozoology. There are things out there that nature wants to keep for itself, and for those fortunate or perhaps unfortunate enough to have come across one of these cryptids, their stories are fantastic to be shared. So get comfortable, grab your Skinwalker charms, and let the darkness take control. I must preface this with a few things. This encounter is second-hand, but was told to me on multiple occasions by the person that experienced it. I am a natural skeptic and cynic, so I can't say that I 100% believe it, but his telling of it was pretty simple yet concise, and did not vary between the retellings. I've known this guy for many years, and his advice and input on just about everything is well reasoned and always helpful, so I'll just try to take his word on it, even if with a grain of salt. So let's get down to business. My friend Marv likes to go solitary camping on occasion, to be at one with nature. He is also an avid gun collector and enthusiast. I don't remember exactly when he said that this took place, but it was a few years back, and he decided to go camping on a whim. He packed his gear, a few guns, a hunting rifle, and a .45 sidearm specifically, and headed out into the country onto a vast swatch of property owned by a friend of his. He had full permission in the works. This happened close to the Kisatchie National Forest, in south/central Louisiana. He liked to hike in pretty deep, and camp at specific spots that he found a few trips prior. These details are kind of sparse, as it's not really the meat and potatoes to this encounter. So he made his way in and set up camp in his usual small clearing for the night. Skipping ahead a few hours, it was now late afternoon, when he heard leaves crunching and twigs being stepped on. He assumed it was an animal at first, and got up from cooking something on the fire to try and get a look. He gazed in the direction of the noise, and saw a man approaching through the trees a good many yards away. He has described his etiquette for dealing with other people in very remote places as always being cautious, as more often than not, the people he comes across are armed like him. He tries to stay friendly, but he still keeps his guard up, looking for any ulterior motives, as you can never tell what some folks are up to in the middle of nowhere. He'll make chit-chat with them, find out generally what they're up to if he can, and occasionally share a meal. He's never really met anyone nefarious as of yet, other than this situation, and maybe one other, but that's a different ordeal. So one thing that sets off small alarm bells for him is that he knows he's the only one with permission to be on this property. And secondly, this guy is not dressed for the location. He says the guy was wearing a white t-shirt, blue jogging shorts, and white socks and sneakers. Mind you, Marv is miles out in the middle of the woods, away from any paths, roadways, houses, or anything really. Nobody is going to casually stroll into his current location dressed like that, unless they are lost or confused. It was early fall, but not quite cool, very normal for Louisiana, so there's a ton of mosquitoes, ticks, and other insects aplenty. You're not going to have most of your skin exposed if you can help it, deep in the woods. I know that all too well from personal experience myself. So Marv assumes something might be up and calls out, "Hey, do you need help with something?" He says it quite loudly, definitely loud enough to be heard. The guy, however, keeps walking, staring directly at him. Marv is starting to get unnerved, and as I said, I know this guy well, and he is as cool as a cucumber in a tense situation. Getting more uneasy as the guy is closing the distance, he gets to his feet and loudly declares, "Hey man, can I help you with something or what?" The guy is now 10 to 15 feet away, standing at the edge of the clearing in the forest. The guy, looking at Marv dead in the eye, speaks and clearly says, "Help me." Marv said he was already starting to actually get worried at this point, because he said the way the guy said this was as if something that didn't exactly know how to talk was saying "help me," or at least that's how he first thought of it. It just didn't sound right. The guy, still unmoving, says, "Help me," again, but this time more emphatic and just really loud. Marv said this is when he was picking up on what was truly wrong about this. He said the timbre of his voice was more female and actually sounded like a recording being played back, and that the guy's lips and mouth movements weren't matching up with the phrase. It was like he was just opening his mouth, emitting the phrase and closing it again. Marv asked, "What do you need help with?" not daring to back up or move whatsoever. The guy, still standing motionless, was staring directly at him and said, "Help me," again, and repeated the phrase another 3 times slowly, but not louder in volume. Marv, now totally unsure of what the hell is going on, interrupts the guy by barking, "Alright, you need to go now unless you actually need my help. Do you need my help or not?" he continues loudly and firmly in tone. The guy didn't miss a beat, and started up with the "help me's" again, and made it as if to take another step in Marv's direction. Marv told me that's when he did the only thing that made sense in the moment, and drew his .45 semi-auto pistol and pointed it at the guy, telling him that he needed to go. The guy started to get more animated and agitated, actually starting to say the phrase louder, over and over, but not stepping closer or backing away. Marv did what he thought was right given his current predicament, assuming he was dealing with an unstable or potentially dangerous individual, and discharged a round into the ground in front of the guy. Now this is where it gets crazy. I'm not kidding. As the guy stops uttering the phrase, he goes silent, and is still staring at Marv full on. He backflips and somersaults into the woods and immediately out of sight. Yes, you heard that right, just like a gymnast. Now I know what you're thinking, because I had the same reaction. This sounds completely made up for sure, but Marv gave me no indication of falsehood, and told me this on multiple times, each time in a dead serious demeanor. Yet, Marv said the guy backflipped away effortlessly, as if pulled by an unseen tension coil. He described it as completely humanly unnatural and totally out of place. The guy had just appeared and repeated the same phrase over and over, eventually almost becoming frantic, before Marv shot at the ground, causing him to flee in the most peculiar manner. Marv said he stood there focused on the forest where the guy just flipped into, and saw and heard no further movement. It was like the guy had never been there. He stayed like this as the sun began to set, and the normal night noises crept in. As I mentioned before, Marv is a pretty unshakable fellow, and actually stayed in the area for the night, and next night, before returning with no further incident. When he has told me and some other friends about this, of course we ask many questions. We prod him to elaborate on the guy's speech sounds. He said the more he thought about it after the incident, the more he was sure it was definitely a female's voice coming from the guy. It was almost like he/it had heard someone say it, and mimicked it like a parrot, or any other talking bird would. Almost like a lure. He doesn't know what it wanted, and didn't give any indication to follow or utter anything else. It reacted immediately to the gunshot, and you know what follows there. He's been back to the property since, with no other strange occurrences. The only other minute detail that I can think of is that he did remember hearing during the early morning of the first night what sounded like a gunshot off in the distance, and it did sound eerily similar to his .45. He thought he may have heard it again on the hike back. There are people that hunt in the area, and of course it could have just been that, so he couldn't be sure. Since this incident, and one other he had in a completely different location, he did some online research of the whole Kisachi area, and found many legends, stories, and supposed encounters dealing with skinwalkers, and other unnerving bits of Native American folklore in the area. Not to mention mimics, and other similar supposed creatures. A lot of his encounters line up with these tales, but there's nothing tangible to prove it. But even as a skeptic, it does make me wonder about strange things in the remote and untouched areas of the world that can't be explained. I am 23 now, and the time that this occurred was my first summer out of high school, and me and my 3 friends, fresh off their freshman year of college, decided to live together. One of my friends, my best friend for years, Earl, had a long-time girlfriend whose father owned the property. It was a decently sized plot of land with several old cabins on it, their house, which was large and out in the back of the woods, and a few other scattered buildings. I think it used to be a campground before he bought it to live on it and run his business out of it. We live in southern Maine, and the property is heavily wooded. Pine Tree State for the win. The house that we lived in was at the very front of the property, right on the road. The owner's house was at the very rear and could only be accessed by a dirt road with 2 ditches on the side. A 1-minute walk towards the woods from our front house was a small little cabin across a clearing, and it was furnished and powered. In the house was me, Earl, John, and Chuck. We all had some different girls and girlfriend pals and partied through the summer. We would frequently come here to the cabin and the owner's house before moving in. Anyway, enough with the scene setting. Some of this story is from word of mouth from the others living in the home, but we have all been friends a long time, and I trust them implicitly, and I witnessed enough myself to know that this all lined up. So, the first encounter was at the very beginning of summer, before we even moved in. It was evening and dark, and everyone was at the owner's house watching a movie. As I slowly drive my car down the dirt path to the owner's, something white and large in size ran in front of my car. It was a blur. It was too fast to really catch what it was, but being in the woods I assumed it was some kind of albino fox. I shrugged it off and made my way to the house. A week later, we were all situated and moved into the front home by the street, and things were great. I'll admit the front area of the property was spooky, despite being the most open and least wooded. The owner's mother had lived in our house and died years ago. We could see an old statue of Mother Mary off in the woods that was always kind of sketchy. Across the street was a small independent tire shop with a small dirt lot. Only thing in the house when we moved in was some kind of antique cheetah statue, which appeared to be from the 60s, tall and skinny in a sitting position, and went up to mid-waist, so we put it in the corner of the hallway. Thought it was neat and retro. For a few weeks all was normal. Admittedly, some friends experimented with some different substances, like LSD and salvia once or twice, paired with the normals like drinking. I do not believe this impacted what happened though. We have some parties, invite girls over for some fun, jam out on the guitars in the cabin. It was a great time. But things slowly became tense and went downhill. A lot happened, and I believe that they are all connected, even though they seem disjointed and random. After a few weeks of fun, Earl had developed crippling insomnia due to some tooth pain that unfortunately he could not afford to fix. He would clock maybe 1 hour of sleep per night, and slowly became more and more irritable, but nothing too serious. One night, John and Earl and some of their friends, who we will call Don, are out back in the cabin. They had done some slight drinking, but John was a straight edge who never touches anything of any kind. Earl is playing on his guitar and singing some of our original tunes. This portion of the story, until I came into play, is recanted by John. During the night, our fourth roommate Chuck is asleep in bed, while I'm in my room, as Earl plays his guitar, and he says to Don, "Wow man, those are some great harmonies you're doing. Since when can you sing?" Don looks a little confused and tells Earl that he wasn't singing along. Earl starts singing again, but stops when he hears the harmonies a second time. He thought his ears were tricking him, but John and Don had heard them too. They put the guitar down and decide to investigate. They walk through the clearing briefly, startled by Mother Mary in the woods, until they reach the front of the road. From across the street they see the biggest white cat they'd ever seen. Not just a cat, but the size of a larger dog or mountain lion. They scramble to try and get a video with their phones, at which point I see them out the window and run down to meet them. As I hit the yard, I'm just stunned as they are, and see this giant white bobcat sitting on a hill across the tire shop. It's massive, about the size of a German shepherd. But something was wrong. Its tail. It had a gross, nasty, fleshy tail, as if it had the tail of a rat. It's long, so I can't see all of it, but it's definitely proportionally wrong and way longer than a normal cat, let alone fleshy and bald. Don picks up a rock and throws it at it. I kid you not, all four of us, two fully sober, watching this thing stand up on its hind legs and calmly walk into the woods, dragging its tail behind us, and we book it inside. Earl is more sleepless than normal, trying to drink himself to sleep. He is successful and Don does the same. I don't remember how John and I fell asleep that night. Every creak of the house petrified me. The next morning we wake Chuck up and thoroughly scare him. We're all kind of on edge for the rest of the day, but with the sun out, the fun starts back up, and we put it to the back of our minds. Today, Earl confides in me about his lack of sleep, and how he does not expect this experience to help. Night comes again, and everyone decides to have a low-key evening after all the excitement from the evening prior. That evening, Chuck suffers from his first and only night terror of his life. He's awake in his bed, and he's in some kind of paralysis, and he hears the growls / snarls / screams of a cougar-type creature or bobcat as a giant white mass runs across the doorway of his room. He slowly regains movement and comes into my room to tell me what happened. He doesn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the next morning we bring the cheetah statue into the cabin from across the clearing. For another few weeks, nothing tremendous happens. We continue to be on edge, and Earl slips a little further, but things are slowly getting better. I do a little research about what we've seen: cryptozoology, demons, and monsters. Finally, I make a breakthrough. I find an article, nothing big, from an old book about Maine urban legends. The book was from a while ago, and described something called the Ding-Ball Cougar, or Plunkus. It just sounds better as Plunkus. Anyway, I said Ding-Ball was a cougar, whose last tail joint was ball-shaped and bare of hair and flesh. Ding-Ball was fond of human flesh and would sing with a human voice to lure the incautious out of their cabins at night, where it waited in the dark to crack their skulls with its tail. My heart stopped as I read this, because it matched so well with our experience. Mind you, it said nothing of walking on its hind legs or being white, but the similarities still shocked me, and I kept this info on my chest for a while. A few days later, Earl's insomnia came to a head. It would be about 10 p.m, and I laid in bed before I heard a massive crash. From the audible vantage point I was at, it sounded like someone had fallen down the stairs. I rushed into the hallway as Earl came from his room, and I yelled, "What the hell was that?" Earl turned to me and raised his fist and said, "Shut up, man," and ran down the stairs. I sat in my room for a minute confused, and after about 20 minutes I went to my car and drove to my parents to spend the night. I stayed the rest of the day with my parents too. That night, Earl called me to apologize. The crashing had come from his room, where he had angrily kicked a chair due to oral pain. And when I came out, he thought I was angrily yelling, "What the hell was that?" to him. We made up on the phone, and then he asked me something peculiar. "Hey man, did you come home today at all?" "No, why?" He explained that he was the last one out, so he had to lock the doors, as we had been for about 2 weeks since we all started freaking out. Earl had the only key. "Okay, and?" I asked. He sounded a little scared when he said this. "The cheetah statue was on top of Chuck's bed. I told him not to touch it." Even later that night, when I got back to the house, Chuck's room was closed, and we went and took a look. The cheetah had been placed in the center of Chuck's bed, standing up. He had a lumpy mattress, and the fact that it had stood so straight was impressive and unnatural. It was not leaning, tilted, or anything. As soon as I touched it, it fell over, and the next day I took it and hid it somewhere no one else could bother to look for it. In one of the older cabins, where they only use for storage. The thing is, the next night, it was back in Chuck's room. The bed was made up neatly, and the cheetah was placed under the blankets with its head out, as if it were taking a nap. We burned the statue the next day. I wish I could say that solved everything, but it didn't. Over the next few weeks, we continued to be stalked by white blurs in the corner of our vision, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional faint whisper of singing in the distance. At one point, the Mother Mary statue was even turned backwards, no longer facing the home. I'm not sure when, but we only noticed at this point. A few days passed and summer was up, and we all left. We still visit different spots of the property, but avoid that house. We hear the occasional rustle, but we don't watch for colour anymore, because we don't want to see the white blur. After all this, I don't know what the Plunkus is. A beast? A spirit? A demon? All of them? All I know is that Earl never got his tooth fixed. The pain just went away. Chuck has never had a night terror since, and I know that it's still there. And I remember how old and mysterious my state still is. Hell, Stephen King loves it for a reason, right? I had pet rabbits as a kid. They lived outside in a cage, a really big cage inside a bigger shed, which was pretty nice for rabbits, and it had heating and everything. I got home late from something, maybe a family party. I went out with my older sister to feed them, and at the time we were about 5 and 7. On the way to the cage, we both saw what appeared to be a really tall, thin man running inhumanly fast through our backyard. We live in what is basically a swamp, and he had to have cleared this giant downed tree and run through mud and ferns. But regardless, he seemed to be going over 15, maybe even 20 miles per hour. We both dropped what we had and bolted back inside. At the time, our parents were able to convince us it was a deer or something. We wanted to believe it, so we convinced ourselves that it was. I convinced myself for over a decade of what we saw. But fast forward to a few years ago, I was at a park near my house with a friend late at night. I pulled into the dirt road drive in my Outback and parked facing the old practice field. It was far too foggy to see across the field, except for a split second, where we could see what appeared to be a very tall man running across the field. We drove as fast as that Subaru could take us, drifting out of the park. Now, a year or two ago, I was at the same park, under similar circumstances. This time it was clear but very windy. From across the field and into the field, we heard a crash and a scream. Not a crash, then a scream, they were simultaneous. It was the most shrill, terrifying, god-awful screech I'd ever heard. More human than a Fisher cat, but far louder and more shrill than even a woman. We noped out of there as fast as we could. There was also one other thing that happened. Anyway, this was when I was a sophomore in high school, around the same time of the first encounter at the practice field from the previous story. I was at my friend Nick's house, with a couple of other friends, and we were all staying the night. It was just the 4 of us high schoolers there at night. That same night, there was a severe weather warning due to a storm that had the potential to create tornadoes, which it did closer to the Connecticut River Valley, and parts of Massachusetts. I think there was somewhere around 3 small tornadoes that night, pretty wild for New England/New York. The wind, even without the tornadoes, was intense, and we were just glad that this house had a good-sized yard with no tall trees to fall. It was pouring rain, there was lightning, and the classic backdrop to your spooky story. We're all set up on the second story of the top floor. One of our friends was asleep and somehow managed to sleep through this entire ordeal. The rest of us were all awake, talking about how we weren't in danger of tornadoes, except one of us was convinced that we were all going to die that night. Mid-conversation, there's a loud bang, and the entire house rattles. Is that even supposed to happen? What could it be? We come up with some theories. Is there a tree down? No trees, earthquake? No reports online? Maybe wind? No trees downed outside? We're down to the bulkhead, just slammed the door shut, and we grab a few knives and head downstairs. In the living room, we all notice for the first time how many porcelain dolls Nick's mother owns. We check every room to find nothing but those creepy dolls, but nothing that could cause a bang. There are 2 rooms left, the basement and the closet, that is barely enough to hold folded linens. We decide if the bulkhead isn't locked, then we forgot to close it, and there'll be water in the basement, and the sound we heard was the wind knocking it shut. If the bulkhead is locked, we remembered to close it. The bulkhead was locked shut, and the floor was bone dry. The sound wasn't the bulkhead. There's one room left, and it's the closet. What could be in the closet? It's only big enough to hold Houdini himself. We open it up, and instantly something falls and we hear the sound of glass shatter. Looking at the ground, it's one of the dolls. What was it doing in the closet? Why would it be propped up that easily to let it fall? We couldn't care. We just went upstairs and did our best to fall asleep. It's something that we all try not to think about, but every once in a while we hear a murmur or a grunt, and we'll never know what it was or where it was coming from. We also don't know whatever happened to that broken doll. Let me start off by saying that this is not my story, but it was such a crazy encounter that I have since asked each of my friends throughout the years to recount the events. This happened around the year 2000. About a year after this took place, I started dating one of these friends, and that's when I first heard about this dog/wolf story. I have since asked each friend over the years, and miles apart, and they all remember the encounter the very same way. Before my ex was even my boyfriend, he and our other friends were all about 17 to 18 years old. At that age, I remember it being an adventure to find a place to smoke. Let's hike to this place and puff. The good old days. The four of them decided to drive to Mount Pisgah, a beautiful wooded area outside of Eugene, Oregon. It's more of a hill, but it's nature in its prime form for sure. I've been out there many times growing up, and I know exactly what trail they were on. It was Jay, my ex-boyfriend, and his best friend, Barry, and their girlfriends, Sarah and Mary. They had driven in Barry's little white sedan, parked in the parking lot, and hiked the trail to the river where they smoked some bowls. The group spent the day out there swimming, puffing and swimming, just being typical teenagers. I can imagine the hunger is what drove them to go home after a few hours, as the sun began to set. Either activity alone is bound to get someone hungry, let alone both. So they walked along the well-worn main dirt path to the parking lot. This has since been paved, and it doesn't take not 20 minutes for them to get back to the little footbridge by the parking lot that they had crossed when they hiked in. When they reached this small footbridge near the parking lot, Barry looked out into the vast fields between them and the wooded area, and noticed a huge dog. The dog was just sitting there, not looking scary, just looking like a humongous friendly dog, about 70 yards away. It was starting to get dark, but from Mary's description and the drawing she did later for me in 2005, it was very shaggy and furry. My friends continued to walk across this small wooden bridge, and one of the girls screamed. The big dog was now on its hind legs, standing much closer than when they had seen it a few seconds earlier. It had traversed most of the large field in the seconds it took them to get past the 10-foot-long bridge. Whatever this thing was, it was fast, quiet, and stealthy. My four friends ran to the car, and they had the classic cliche, "I can't get the key in," because Barry was fumbling madly for the keys. At this point, the dog was just standing at the very edge of the parking lot, looking at them. As my ex Jay had said, every time they looked up, he would be closer, but not moving. All of them recounted how surreal it was to see a dog standing on its hind legs. I don't know if it ran for a few ticks and then stood up again at intervals in the field, but that's the way they describe it. Many times I asked them, "Are you sure it wasn't a bear?" Nope, it was definitely a dog standing on its hind legs, a big dog that was stalking them. This is in the Lane County, Oregon in the year 2000. There are few, if any, bears out there. It would be odd, but then again I wasn't there. The kids got in the car, sped off, leaving the Pig's dog to do its own business. I've never had any reason to doubt any of their stories. In fact, Sarah doesn't like to talk about the incident because it's just too creepy for her to recall. I am 16. This happened the 8th of July, 2016. I live in Massachusetts, which is where this happened. The day started normally. I went to school, had a test in vet tech, as I go to a technical high school, and one of its classes is vet tech, and I took the bus home. Both of my parents were at work like normal, but after 3 hours when my mum should have been home, I got worried. About 5 p.m. I got a call from my dad, who told me my mum was in a car accident, and that they are both in the hospital, and would be there for a while. It got very late, almost 10, and my parents weren't home, so I decided to put my younger brothers to bed. I stayed up, waiting for my parents to get home, and I spent my time reading and writing an essay for school until around 1 a.m. I got a call from my dad who said he wasn't coming home. He was staying in a motel that was closer to the hospital. I got off the phone and finished the part of the essay I was on. I gathered my stuff and walked through the kitchen, heading towards the stairs that led upstairs, when a moaning sound reached my ears. The moaning came from outside. It was really loud and stopped occasionally, like whatever was making the sound voice was cracking. It sounded pained. I turned on the outside light to see an ugly sight. Sitting in the yard just a few feet from the house was a coyote. It was horribly injured. Its head was partially caved in on the left side, its paw was bleeding, and this was evident by the pool of blood with the paw in the direct middle. It appeared that it had a long deep gash all the way down its back, and all of the wounds were bleeding. I reached for my pocket, trying to get my phone, only to realize I had left it on the table I'd been working on. I turned and rushed back to the table. I was planning to call a local vet clinic that I knew was open 24/7. When I reached the table, the moaning got much louder and more pained. Then it stopped. I grabbed my phone and ran back to the window. At first I was confused. The coyote was gone, replaced by a common tabby cat. It was odd. The cat was sitting directly in the same place the coyote had been. After the initial shock, I noticed that the tabby cat had the same injuries. Same bleeding paw, same caved-in head, and the same gnashes down its back. Something was different, however. I couldn't pinpoint the difference for a good 3 minutes. Then I realized that the right shoulder blade was kind of pointing out at a completely unnatural angle. It looked deformed and painful, and I dropped my phone as soon as I noticed this. When my phone hit the floor, the cat began meowing loudly. I stared at it as it meowed and stared right back at me. It was looking directly at me, unblinking. After a good while, I slowly picked up my phone off the floor. I straightened back up and looked out the window, and the cat was gone. I had only looked away for a few seconds, and in that short time, the horribly injured cat had vanished. Some unknown feeling made me go outside to look for the cat. I don't know what it was. Worry? Perhaps curiosity. Hell, it might have been something the animal made me feel. I have no clue. Now outside, I first walked to the puddle of blood and looked for a trail of it. I found it and started to follow the trail, and found that it ended as soon as it passed the gate. To make sure that I could see it in the dark, I pulled out my phone and illuminated the ground around me. I looked around for 5 minutes, but didn't see anything. Just like the cat, the trail had also vanished. I called the veterinary clinic, and they sent out a car, and they looked around, but the trail was gone, and they couldn't find it. At the time, I didn't think of this until afterwards, but I realized that there was no trail of blood leading to my house. I have no idea what the hell this thing was. none of my searches have turned up any results close to what I saw. I am completely convinced that the coyote and the cat were the same creature, and that it is neither a coyote nor a cat. Afterwards, I asked around, and there were no records of dead cats or coyotes turning up with injuries. The creature couldn't get far with those wounds that it had. Does anyone have any ideas of what I saw? So as a kid, I loved to burn spiders. It's something that now I think of, and it sounds horrifying, but at that age I didn't even care. So as soon as I found a spider, I let my mother know, and she would burn it with an enormous lighter. I don't really know how many times or how many spiders we incinerated, but my bet is that it's an enormous amount. It's worth noting that when you burn a spider, it gets stiff, and the legs get rolled in, and at the end, you get a sphere-shaped spider, and if you pay close attention, you will hear the crunching of the poor little thing. This was the main procedure whenever I found a spider, and it was fun for me and my brothers, except for the one spider, the last one we burnt. I remember that I was playing with my brother. We were running all over the house, and we suddenly saw a spider. It was the most ugly thing in the world. Thin legs, yellow, with black and green stripes all over it. It was the biggest spider I have ever seen so far. Not that big to be a tarantula, though. So we run back to the kitchen where my mother was. We told her that we had found a spider. At this point, she knew what to do already, so we didn't have to tell her. She picks the lighter and goes with us. The spider was standing on the corner of a room. My mum uses the lighter, and as soon as the flame touches the spider, we hear this extremely loud scream all over the room, and only inside that room. It was like a baby screaming. Remember that I told you it was worth noting what happens to spiders when they get burnt? Well, this spider was different. It literally turned into dust, black and extremely thin, and there was no trace of the spider. I mean, not even a half-burnt leg. It just completely turned to dust. From that day on, if I happened to find a spider, let's say that I'm at my friend's house, I kind of feel something in the corner, and guess what? There'll be a spider there. There's also a lot of spider activity in my bathroom. My father finishes his shower, and he actually checks to see if there are any insects before, and after the experience, I can't stand spiders, and I get paralyzed whenever I see one. And after he would check, he'd go out of the bathroom, and when I would get in, I'd remove the curtain, and there would be a spider in the middle of the tub, as if it were waiting for me. Here in Mexico, there are legends of nahuales, which are humans that can turn into animals and insects, and that there are some people who believe that I may have burnt one. Since it was like a baby screaming, people say it might also be a baby that was turned into a spider by a witch. What do you think? As for my fear of spiders, I can't do much. I have also seen some experts, and they do not believe the story, so their therapies don't seem to work, which I understand, and I also accept the spider sighting like a punishment for having been so aggressive with them in the past. The spider thing only happens with me, not my brother or my mother. I think it was because I was the one who enjoyed it the most, but I will never know. This is one of the things that I remember almost as if it happened yesterday. I'm from Mexico, so as you can imagine, there are a lot of folklore/legends from around these parts. This event happened a year ago. I don't remember my age, but I was probably around 8, and I am now 19. As a kid, I was very scared of the paranormal, and I can recall a couple of times something of the matter happening to me, but I have no proof, only vivid memories. At the time, I was quite friendly with the neighbour's kid. I even stayed in their house a few times, and did some travelling with them. There was one time we went to a little village called Chelma that is known for being very religious and having religious migration there. So we usually went to pray and then wash ourselves with the water from a special kind of tree, an awete. Either way, on the road to the village, there's a fairly dense forest of pines, and being the shy person that I am, I usually just look out the window. And after a few minutes just watching the trees, I saw a big black silhouette that was about 2 meters tall. It had red glowing eyes like a canine that you would expect from a werewolf. At first I thought I was seeing things, so I just kept turning my head and checking my vision. The road we were going on meant that we were travelling at about 50 miles an hour, and going at this speed didn't make things look like we were travelling very fast. I kept watching it for 2 minutes, then it turned its eyes at me, looked at me, and as soon as I did, I reached for my friend and told him to look that way. He said there was nothing, but when I looked back, it was there. This happened at least 3 times until it just disappeared. I didn't tell anyone this story until years later. I thought it could be a nawal or something like that, but there's the absence of proof. I'm kind of skeptical about this, but I'd love to hear anyone's opinions on what it could be. I live in Mexico, a country well known for its rich culture. However, many foreigners don't know about Mexico's paranormal scene. I work as an English teacher, and sometimes I include conversation topics as part of my activities in the class. It is very common for Mexicans to start talking about paranormal stuff at school. There are even teachers who share their experiences from time to time. So, I decided to include a conversation about the paranormal in my class. As I expected, participation in the class rose, and everyone wanted to share their own experiences. Seeing that this activity was amusing and highly effective, I decided to repeat it in many of my groups. I got experiences about ghosts as usual, but something new came across. Nawales. Some people declare that things happened to them, and others claimed that some things happened to friends or relatives. Nawales are people who can transform into animals, or maybe animals who can transform into animal humans. Who knows? An experience with a Nawal is pretty much the same as always. People are having fun at night, might be at a party or just outside their home, and then someone comes seeking problems. It looks like a drunkard who just wants to fight or steal things, but after feeling threatened, it changes its shape. The most common animal tends to be a dog. I'm shocked by the fact that many people just told me this. This isn't on TV or over the internet. Bear in mind, my students are old folks who are engineers now, and I go to their companies and teach them English. So I have the opportunity to speak about this with people from different backgrounds of all walks of life, who certainly don't know each other. Even one of my students told me about how a friend got traumatized after seeing a man transform into a dog, and how this friend couldn't speak for 3 days because he was in shock. Let it be known that a lot of crazy stuff happens within this country. My dad's uncle and his family live in rural Louisiana, but not too rural in a way. Anyway, both my dad, my brother and I travel there, and I came here when I was younger, so it was nothing new, and I was around 15 at the time. The second day rolls around and it's 4 a.m. at night. I begin to start hearing an eerie sound that sounded like a trumpet, but I was too tired, fell back asleep and thought nothing of it. Now the third day is when stuff gets weird. While my dad and uncle went out to buy groceries, it was just me and my brother, and my dad's aunt at the house. So being smart intellectuals, we decide to go off down the woods off a beaten trail until we see a big, ragged white house on the other side of the swamp. It looked fairly abandoned, so we go around the lake and see a bunch of old cars with motors running. We immediately go back and tell my aunt, and she thinks nothing of it. That night, we heard loud screaming and chanting coming from the direction of the house. It starts getting closer and closer, until we see a bunch of hillbillies around our house with lighters and small torches. I'm freaked the hell out and proceed to hide. In Louisiana, hillbillies with torches who tell you to evacuate the area are best listened to. So my aunt does as told, and we think they're gonna loot the house. So my aunt and older brother go up to their supposed leaders of this group of 20 to 30 people and ask what's happening. They claim their son has been taken and transformed into a rougarou, which is like a werewolf standing up. The next day, their son is found brutally ripped apart, with claw marks and slashes all over his body. Yeah, never again. For context, this is Australia. I was travelling to this campsite about 20 minutes past a small town, and had gotten there about an hour-ish after dark. Now I was the only person there, and when I called the off-site caretaker to book, he said that since it was just me, that I could use the day shelter/kitchen. So instead of setting up my tent in the dark, I decided to drag my sleeping bag inside where I had some actual light. Hours later, I realized I require something from my car, so I drag open the sliding door, and this wasn't a small door, it was one of those big loud ones like you would see on a barn. I was looking out into the darkness, as there were no lights or moon, just the glow from the lights behind me. Now, in case you've never been in a situation like this, when the light reaches about 10 meters, there has to be about 1 meter where it drops off into nothingness. And in this small patch I saw 4 legs. These were not just normal legs. They were those of a dog, and long like human legs. They were bright white, and stretched up to where they could connect to the body of the animal, but there was nothing there. Then it began to move. The legs walked. They walked in parallel to the building, making sure that they remained in the grey corridor, then disappeared into the darkness. I decided that I didn't really need to get whatever it was from my car, and slept barricaded in the tiny office. To this day, I don't know what they were, and I have looked into it, nor do I know how long they were there before I saw it. But I do know that the thing was smart enough to know how humans see, and where the grey corridor was from my viewpoint. It was back in about 4th grade. I couldn't have been older than 8 or 9. I lived in the country near a small Minnesotan town called Iota, and it was pretty out there in the middle of nowhere. At about 6:50 in the morning, I got on the bus like I would any other day to head to school. I had an hour-long morning ride and an hour-long evening ride. About 3/4 of the way there, we went down a side street. A kid named Jacob lived there, and there were about 3 houses in total down the street. In between the houses were open fields. As Jacob was picked up, I looked on the opposing side of the road, and saw 3 figures like I had never seen before next to a white house. They were black, long, lanky. They looked almost like panthers, but distorted in some way. They were much bigger than panthers, and their faces were almost pointed at the bottom. They looked almost reptilian. It was difficult to see details in the morning fog. They crawled on all 4s, and one of them looked to be a bit smaller than the other 2. One of the big ones walked ahead a little bit, and waited for the other 2 to catch up. They disappeared behind the house, and I scrambled for my little BlackBerry hoping to catch a picture. But as we moved away from the house, there was no sight of them. I thought about what I had just seen, and didn't particularly know what to think. I told my friend Erica about it, and she didn't flat out tell me she thought I was lying, but I could feel it. The house is now gone. It must have been demolished. and it was fairly old and looked to be in fairly bad shape when the incident occurred. Though I am not, and I've never really been religious, I did have a fair amount of strange occurrences happen in my childhood, this being one of the biggest. For the past 7 years or so, I have pushed it to the back of my mind, but every now and then it will come up. As I was listening to a podcast mentioning skinwalkers, I thought of this experience, and thought I would share it with you guys for help. If anybody has any clues as to what this could be, please do let me know. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. It took a while to get these stories. I didn't have enough for a Skinwalker video by itself, so I mashed together with Cryptids to make a pretty fun video. I mean, I really enjoyed this. Some cryptids that I had never even heard of, and I love hearing of all these new and creepy things. If you did, don't forget to show your love. Drop a like on the video. Leave a comment with what you thought about it. And if you're new here, you know what to do. The subscribe button and bell icon are waiting for you. And you won't regret it, because there's new scary content every night. If there's a story that you'd like to share, email it to me, or send it to my Reddit. I love receiving new stories. Now back to what I was saying at the very start of the video. Well done for remembering an hour later. My brother's channel is linked very soon on screen and in the description. It is some pretty awesome content, and it would mean a lot to me if you'd check it out. Oh, there it is. There's the link. Please check it out. It's so awesome, and a perfect segue from tonight's video, I believe. But with that being said, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.